Okay, so we'll go for the first unit of 413, isn't it? And the name of the topic is called as Borders and Boundaries. Okay, so the topic Borders and Boundaries, Women in India's Participation, 1998, which is written by Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin. I'll just give you the introductory information about this particular book. It is a pivotal work, or you can say that a very important work that explores the complexity. Complex means something which is called as typical and multifaceted impact of the 1947 partition of India. It focuses on the experiences of women during this traumatic time. So it means you are talking about 1947 partition of India, and means how the woman's experience during this traumatic time that has been discussed in this book. The book is a collection of essays that addresses the personal, social, political, and psychological effects of partition, particularly how it shaped the lives of women, isn't it? Now, if you talk about that, the book, if I give you the overview and structure of the book, you find out that the book is divided into several parts and that offer various perspectives on the partition, various goal on the partition, with a focus on the specific impact on women. So it includes personal narratives. Personal narratives means personal story, historical analysis, how women's role in the history that has been also analyzed, and feminist perspectives. Feminist perspectives means you are talking about means female sides or female scope. The chapters are, you can say, written by various scholars. You can say with the introduction by Menon and Bhasin, who have been providing the foundational context for the book. So, if you look at the historical context, what do you find out? Now, the partition of India, which resulted in the creation of two separate nations, India and Pakistan, and it was a violent and traumatic event. Why and how? Now, more than 1 million people died in the violence, right? And that ensued or that moved on. And millions of others were also displaced, killed, murdered, and you would find out also displaced. The borders drawn between the two countries, India and Pakistan, the borders drawn between the two countries not only divided land, but also you can say families. Families are separated. You must have seen the movie called Gadar. So, communities and identities. So, what are the things that you would find out? Now, when the separation occurred, because of that separation, you would find out the two countries not only divided the lands, but also you would find out families, communities, and identities. Women were disproportionately affected, excessively affected, experienced nothing but a sexual violence, displacement, separated, and the loss of family members. So here, the writer Menon and Bhasin, who provide a historical analysis of how partition affected women's bodies and women's identities, isn't it? And they present also how women as the symbols of the national divide, with their honor, with their respect tied to the success or failure of partition. So that is what you would find out. So in that case, you can find out the one of the important parts in this particular book is what woman, right? Or you can say that woman role in the partition, woman's experiences also. The authors, the authors. Why do I say that the authors? Because here we are talking about Menon and Bhasin, who are the writers. The authors focus on what? Focus on the main role, central role that women played during the partition. Women are subjected to violence. Women are subjected to including rape, abduction, and forced migration. But their experiences were often silenced in historical accounts. Menon and Bhasin highlight how partition literature, memoirs, and oral histories from women offer a rich but often underrepresented. So they have not been presented properly. So their goal on the event, perspective on the event, so that have not been presented. So here you would find out the book explores the emotional and psychological toll that partition had on women, who not only suffered personal shock, trauma, but also had to, navigate the gendered expectations, or directed the gendered expectations placed upon them during this period of what? Upheaval, or you can say that violence, or called as a severe uh, means imbalance. If you talk about the woman's experiences, we also talk about woman and body. The major theme, or one of the major themes in this book, is what? The association of women's bodies with the borders that were being drawn. The violence against women, especially sexual violence, was used as nothing but a tool or instrument to mark the division between India and Pakistan. Menon and Bhasin discuss how women became symbols of the religious, and women become the symbol of nationalic conflict or national conflict. With their bodies, means women become sites of territorial disputes. Territorial means called as geographical disputes. The loss of respect, honor, the experience of sexual violence, and the role of women as the symbols of community and nationhood are explored in detail. So, in this particular book, you also find out that called as the next one, beside women's experience, beside women and their bodies, we also find out partition and identity. Please do understand what are the key points which we are discussing in this particular book. Another significant aspect of the book is its exploration of how partition impacted women's identities. When we say that the division of India not only led to the disintegration or separation of families and communities, but also forced women to, confront the idea. Confront means what? To stand still before the idea of identity itself. Women had to navigate a changing socio-political landscape that often meant leaving behind their home, leaving behind their community and culture. They had to redefine themselves. Who had to redefine themselves? Women had to redefine themselves as citizens of newly formed states. And the book examines how the concept of national identity was often granted or was often gendered. So the next one that you would find out is called it's a silence and memory. The book emphasizes how the trauma of partition was largely silenced, particularly for women. Much of the violence and displacement women endured went unrecorded in mainstream historical narratives. So you find out many of the historical stories in which you would find out means the kind of a violence and displacement that uh, occurred to women, particularly to women, have not been recorded, have not been told. So Menon and Bhasin highlight how the trauma or shock of partition was not only a historical event, but also a lived experience that was passed down to generation. It means one generation to another generation, often marked by silence. What occurred to the mother, that the same occurred to the daughter, but no one opened or raised against it. So, and it was called as a silence. However, through partition literature, the voices of women are being reclaimed. Now, through partition literature means such kind of a books indicate nothing but what means the voices of women. And the book presents these stories as nothing but important to understand the full impact of partition. Then we talk about feminist analysis, right? A feminist means what? Someone who takes the sides of the female or who does the work for the female. A female improve means women's empowerment. So a feminist lens is central to the book's approach. Menon and Bhasin criticizes the traditional historical narratives. Criticizes means what? They felt that what happened in history was nothing but insult to women. So, which often overlook or marginalized women's experiences. So, historical stories which are published, they often do what? They often overlook. It means ignore or ignore to whom? Ignore to women's story or marginalized women's experiences. So these two authors argue that, Menon and Bhasin argue that women's experiences of violence, displacement, and trauma were not simply a consequences of partition, but but were deeply intertwined with the broader gender structure of Indian society. The book offers a what you can say the book offers a criticism of nationalism, religious identity, and patriarchal society, and suggests that partition was also a moment of feminist political struggle. Partition was a moment of feminist political struggle. Now, throughout this book, Menon and Bhasin call for the reclamation of women's stories from the margins. They focus or they stress the importance of including these stories in the broader narrative of Indian history. Women's voices, particularly those who lived through the violence of partition, provide nothing but a very important insight, valuable insights into the human cost of political decision. The book supports for the inclusiveness or inclusion of women's experiences in what? Academic discourse or academic discussion and historical accounts of partition. So the book supports what? The book supports that how women include or women's experiences in academic discourse and historical account of partition are included. So, all total, if you talk about the book called Borders and Boundaries, is nothing but a powerful feminist in the historiography of partition. So it changes or it creates or it recreates or it reframes reframes the way we understand the event. It places women's experience at the front part. The book is not just a study of partition, but also a study of how history is written and remembered. It calls for a more inclusive and detailed understanding of partition. It gives all the information. So you can find out one that includes the stories of those who experienced whose experiences were silenced or ignored. If I say that the impact and contributions, we can say that the book is considered a seminal work that in the field of partition studies and women's history, it brought attention to the necessity for a gender perspective on historical events. Second, it tries to point out that the female's relation or female's relevance by highlighting what? The gendered experience of partition. So Menon and Bhasin contributed to the females' rethinking of nationalism, identity, and history in South Asia. So the next, which is also called as a memory and trauma, like you can find out, the book plays in an important role in the study of memory and trauma, particularly in how traumatic events are remembered and are retold. So overally, you can say that borders and the boundaries is an important contribution to understanding the social and political ramifications of the partition of India. It offers a picture, critical picture into how this event, which one is the event? You are talking about the partition event. So, how this event reshaped the lives of women in profound and often painful ways. Through its feminist lens, it redefines the scope of partition literature and it provides a new, you can say that, a new avenue for exploring the intersection of gender, memory, and history. So, you can say that what if you consider that more idea about these borders and boundaries, you can find out Women in India's Partition by Ritu Menon and Kamla Bhasin. They tried to present several critical aspects of the book that highlights its importance in both historical and feminist context. What are they? Historical and feminist context. And these elements go beyond the primary picture or primary things and structure that already mentioned. And it addresses the deeper picture the book offers into the social political dimension of partition. So when I say that partition and the gendered politics of nationalism, you can say at the heart of borders and boundaries, it is an exploration of how nationalism during the partition of India was inherently gendered. Menon and Bhasin argue that the nationalist debate, both in India and Pakistan, was often constructed around the metaphor of a nation as a woman. So India and Pakistan both are considered or compared directly with the means nation as a woman. So which is a pure, sacred, and need of protection. The concept of respect, often associated with the what? Female body, became a central symbol of both countries' identity. The division of the land, India and Pakistan, was portrayed or pictured as a division between these symbolic female bodies. Women, therefore, were not merely passive victims, they were symbolic carriers of the nation's purity and honor. And this expectation that placed on women's bodies became a, you can say, central aspect of partition violence. The book or the book's feminist perspective highlights how this idea was used to justify the sexual violence that perpetrated during partition, where the rape and abduction of women were not just acts of individual aggression, but part of the larger violent process of territorial demarcation. When we think of the experience of displacement and forced migration, you can say the displacement caused by what? Partition were not just geographical but also deeply personal. Families were uprooted, homes were destroyed, and communities fractured. Women, in particular, faced unique challenges during this mass migration. Women of all ages experienced violence, sexual assault, abduction, and forced prostitution as they tried to cross the newly created border. The book examines how these displacements affected women differently than men. Women not only had to navigate physical displacement but also the cultural and emotional dislocation caused by the loss of their traditional roles, social status, and relationship. For many women, especially those who have been separated from their families, the trauma of not knowing the fate of loved ones was compounded by the fear of being seen as contaminated by violence. So, Menon and Bhasin, they show how this kind of a trauma was often left unspoken in historical stories, highlighting that women's experiences were often marginalized in the larger discourse in on partition. The next stage called as the use of women's bodies in naturalistic rhetoric. So one of the most hitting arguments of borders and boundaries is that women's bodies became the terrain, right, where the violence of partition was enacted. So it is a kind of a means border terrain. It's called as a border where the violence of partition was created. During the partition, thousands of women were abducted, raped, or forced to marry men from different religious communities. And this sexual violence was often presented as part of the process of cleansing or purifying the new nations, with women symbolizing both the honor and the political and cultural identity of their communities. Menon and Bhasin explore how these traumatic acts were central to the national narratives of India and Pakistan. In the aftermath of partition, many women were forced to either give up their previous identities or be reclaimed by their families and communities. The experience of sexual violence and its aftermath further complicated the identity to these women. Some were forced to, you can say, commit suicide, while others faced social ostracism or were left to live with the stigma of violence. So, in that case, the book criticizes what? How this physical violence was not only a reflection of what? Male dominated society or patriarchal power, but also of the nationalistic ideology, nation's ideas that wanted to define the nation in terms of place, territorial, and ethnic purity. The emphasis of woman's body or woman's bodily integrity was tied or was connected to the larger political objectives of both India and Pakistan. Now, the next you can get, which is called as a memory and trauma, the silence of partition. We can say that memory plays a significant role in this book, especially in the way partition's trauma was silenced, especially for women. Menon and Bhasin point out that in the aftermath of partition, the experiences of women were not given adequate space in public memory. The trauma of violence and the internalized sense of shame associated with it often stopped women from speaking out. There are two key regions for this silencing. One is called as the patriarchal norms. Patriarchal norms means male dominated society or male made rules. Women were expected to remain silent about their experience of violence. Speaking out about rape or abduction was often considered dishonorable, both for the woman and her family. And these are nothing but the taboos, right? Taboos reinforce the isolation of women's experiences, which remain hidden for years. Then, national narratives, national stories. The focus of partition narratives was often on the political, military, and masculine dimensions of the event. The experiences of women were either minimized or ignored in favor of a more heroic, nationalistic narrative that could, unite communities rather than expose their internal traumas. So, therefore, you can say the book emphasizes the importance of reclaiming women's stories and voices. It uses oral histories, it uses oral memoirs and fiction to argue for a reimagining of partition history that includes the painful and personal experiences of women. It calls for more inclusive and empathetic understanding of this traumatic past, right? So, if you consider that one that considers the full spectrum of a human experience during the time of partition. Okay, feminist and post colonial critics of history. The next one, feminist and post colonial critics of history. In addition to its focus on women narratives, Border and Boundaries offer a broader feminist critique of history and historical methodologies. Menon and Bhasin tries to do what? Menon and Bhasin point out that most historical accounts of partition, particularly in South Asia, have been male dominated. So, reflecting patriarchal priorities, how male or masculine or men are necessary or called as a reflecting patriarchal priorities. This led to a skewed understanding of partition that neglected women's roles and experiences. Furthermore, the book is also a post-colonial critique, examining how the colonial legacy and the role of British imperial policies that contributed to the racial means race, color, and religious divisions that led to partition. The violence and trauma that women experienced were partly the results of what? British colonial practices of divide and rule, which are excessively harmful to existing religious and ethnic tension. So, Menon and Bhasin's feminist perspectives offers a critical lens through which we can reevaluate historical events and political decisions. It challenges the traditional male-centric male-centric historical narratives where male is considered the main and requests the inclusion of women's perspective in the telling of partition history. Then intersectionality, women and the complexity of identity. Another important contribution of borders and boundaries is its small details that approach to identity, which involves intersectionality. Like women's experiences of partition were not just shaped by their gender, but also by their religion, by their class, by their caste, and by their region, area of living. For example, let's say that Muslim women who had to migrate to Pakistan faced different challenges from Hindu and Sikh women. who moved to India. So the book examines how these multiple identities intersected in complex ways during partition. It criticizes the reductionist view of women as only victims and emphasizes the complexities of their experiences. Women from different social backgrounds had to direct not just gender based violence but also the systemic inequalities imposed by caste, class, and religion. The last one that you can find out, it's called as a feminist intervention in history, which could be called as a conclusion, but not the conclusion of the book. It is nothing but the brief information that you would draw from the book. So ultimately, you can say that Borders and Boundaries is a feminist intervention in the study of partition and South Asian history. And Menon and Bhasin, they show how partition as an event has been historically recorded and remembered people, and how women's voices have often been excluded from these stories which have been remembered or recorded. Their work, women's work, offers a new way of understanding partition. It's not just a political or territorial division, but a deeply personal, emotional, and gendered experience. So, therefore, if you read the book, you would find out the book stands as a call to reframe the discourse on partition. On that, or one that includes the voices of women, particularly those who suffered the violence and shock that have been silenced for decades. Through his lens, or through this discussion or lens, borders and boundaries contributes to the larger project of rewriting history in a more inclusive and empathetic way, one that acknowledges the suffering, resilience, and strength of women during and after partition. So, this is what you would find out in the topic called Borders and Boundaries. But the book is this side you need to read so that you will get a lot of other stories, some of the horrible stories, some of the uh, mockery. Mockery means criticism that you also find out. Okay. So try to bring this book, Borders and Boundaries, if possible, to the pouch of like in India. Right. So that ଆମେ ଏଟାକୁ ପୁରା ପଢିବା ଏଟା ଟାଇମ ହେଲାଣି 1:51 ହେଇଗଲାଣି ମତେ ସାଂଘାତିକ ନିଦ ବି ଲାଗୁଛି